What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Shou-Lao has definitively proven himself to be probably the best points and interaction type of deck in the entire game, but there are so many different ways to play this card that we don't know what the best version of that deck really looks like. Here is what I am generally in the space of, but there's frankly a ton of variation in this list. Even among top players, people will prioritize different things. People will try to build against different things. To me, this is the Shou-Lao list that I like the most, give or take an America Chavez for an Iceman. They both go in and out depending on how I feel about things, but largely what this deck is trying to do is optimize for your Shou-Lao and then also optimize for information. Using cards like Cable and Copycat, which are fine mid-range pieces, but also give you a lot of information about what your opponent is doing. This is especially important in a world where we are playing Shou-Lao mirrors, and the people that aren't playing Shou-Lao are playing combo decks that go over the top of Shou-Lao. That information can be the difference between winning and losing. But that is a bit of a high-level thing to care about. And with our only interaction being Deafening Chord and Cosmo, sometimes the information we'll get is that we're just going to lose the game. But generally speaking, the way I've approached Shou-Lao is that he is strong enough to carry an archetype on his own. Other people are hybridizing him into werewolf. I am building him like this. I do think that this carries some significant risk, because if you're not Shou-Laoing, your deck is relatively anemic. You do count on the Shou-Lao points pretty heavily, and that is why other people build a deck with more redundancy. I think that's also an extremely valid approach. My goal here is to equip you as best you can to win these Shou-Lao mirrors when they show up. And I think we also get a bit of additional upside because largely the way the metagame has structured itself is there are Shou-Lao decks, there are tier 2 mid-range decks that do a little bit less points than Shou-Lao decks, and then there are a bunch of combo decks that are trying to ignore everyone playing Shou-Lao and make unaccountably large numbers of points. And cards like Cable and Copycat are actually quite good in those matchups as well. And that's to say nothing of the actual GOAT, Spider-Ham. When I talk about how people are unclear on what the best Shou-Lao deck is, I think this is a great example. This is Ika's list of Shou-Lao, and it is sort of also built to attack the mirror. There are these additional things that make your opponent's Mavericks and Scarlet Spiders sitting on the boards really bad. Lockheed and Clea can absolutely jack up one of those lanes. And of course, there is a Stardust that can prevent Scarlet Spider from being around. So this list has a lot of, I guess you would call them oblique but powerful tools in a straightforward mirror. Rather than disrupting the ability for your opponent to play the cards that are going to win them the game, you say, okay, you played them, but they're just not going to do the things you want them to do. That Maverick is actually going to be -5 or 8 power. You're not getting any of those things that you really want out of this situation. Your Scarlet Spider doesn't actually happen. And counterplaying Scarlet Spider and Maverick is typically the way you want to go about beating the like level 1 Shou-Lao list that I just talked about. So this is actually, I think, a pretty clever thing. I am a little bit interested in investigating how to get our own Maverick in here. I can't figure it out because of the anti-synergy that Maverick has with Werewolf by Night makes me not want to get it in over Werewolf by Night, and it doesn't work with Werewolf by Night, and this deck is much better at being a Werewolf by Night deck, but it does feel like if we can fit a Maverick in here, this deck might really be booming soon. When I said the metagame was just Shou-Lao decks going over the top of Shou-Lao decks, and the other mid-range decks were tier 2, I think that's true for every mid-range deck that isn't this deck. I think the Iris deck is very conceivably the best deck in the game. You could easily talk me into this being the thing. This is an extremely powerful deck that, despite the fact that Shou-Lao sort of naturally counterplays Juggernaut stuff, is still able to keep up on power and on precision. Absolutely phenomenal. One of the best decks in the game, piloted by one of the best players in the game. But I do want to take just a moment to talk about people posting screenshots of beating the rank 1 player, which currently at the time of recording is Iris playing this deck on Reddit. When you play enough games of Marvel Snap, this is just sort of a fundamental thing, you're gonna lose about 45% of them no matter how good you are. In fact, you are a god if you are only losing 45% of your games. An individual loss to whoever is genuinely not a big deal. In fact, it is something that is entirely baked into your understanding of being a good player. That's all. I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but I do want to express that. The best bad deck in the game, Zombie Galacti. The basic premise of this deck, and frankly, a lot of the decks in this section is, okay, look, Shou-Lao does a lot of points, and it does it in a sort of Cosmo and Deafening Chord way a lot of the time, where it's like, all right, this is not particularly easy to beat with a typical mid-range deck, partly because of the way it dodges Shadow King, partly because of how difficult it can be to manage priority against the list. It typically ends up favored because of the large amount of points it has, and also because of the hard difficulty of interacting with it with normal mid-range tools. Which means that one of the big developments in this metagame is people just saying, what if I don't interact with you at all? What if I simply do not care what you are doing, and all I care about is what I am doing? You made a 22 power Scarlet Spider and put it on another lane. That's great. I turned 3 things into 14 power Zombie Galacti on the lane that Scarlet Spider was in. Good luck, buddy. That's the basic idea of this deck, and it's going to be the basic idea of like this entire section of the video is there are limited ways that that deck has, the Shou-Lao deck, any of them really, have to interact with you. There just aren't too many of them. And if you just play a deck that's like, yeah, okay, I don't care about your Cosmo, I don't care about your Deafening Chord, you're probably actually going to be good as long as you can pass the stat check. And yes, Shou-Lao's a good deck. Like, you can do like 40 points in one lane, 30 points in another lane pretty regularly. It's a hard stat check to pass, but it's not impossible. And that is largely the direction the metagame has gone. You're either Shou-Laoing or you're doing something that is completely out of left field, but passes the stat check. It's actually deeply frustrating for this deck specifically that Shou-Lao is able to run Cosmo and oftentimes is incentivized to run Cosmo. The more they start doing this like Stardust type stuff, the happier you are with this. I think if you're doing it, like, the more they're doing, like, you know, oh, I'm going to run a Stardust to beat the mirror, the happier the deck that is playing Symbiote Spider-Man with the Fallen One is going to be. Because that combo absolutely gets clapped by Cosmo. But you will outstat them very easily with what this deck is doing if that is not happening. You will have infinite energy. Now, keep in mind, it's not going to be free. When I say easily, I mean that you're going to have to do math. You're going to have to be like, okay, how do I beat the spider? What do I have to do? If I can't beat the spider lane, how do I beat spider? What is their maximum power output here? You still have to do math. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes you don't. And those are the cool games where you get to just go man spider and it's 70. And then you play a taskmaster and it's also 70. And then they lose. That's really sick. That's a really cool thing to happen because they can't get to 70 literally ever. So what this deck has going for it is largely just it has a ton of beef. There is infinite beef and infinite ways to deploy it late. And that is a really powerful spot to be in. Once you get your, let's say, 13 energy on the final turn of the game, that actually does enable you to do something like play a man spider on that thing, then Hulkbuster the man spider, then Taskmaster that doubled thing. They don't beat that. Surprise Galactus, still a similar premise here. If anything, this was the forefather of these other decks, where the metagame has very clearly split to me between Shou-Lao decks, the Iris deck. I put that in the same category as the Shou-Lao decks. Weirdly, I know that doesn't make any sense, but like it's the good mid-range decks, right? And then just combo decks that are like, I give up on trying to out mid-range this Shou-Lao stuff. I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to try. They get to do whatever they want. I'm going to just do something that has way too many points for them to actually deal with and they can't meaningfully interact with. And Cerebro is a great way to do that. Galactus is a great way to do that. Frankly, you could decouple these and it would still make a ton of sense. I personally think that this is a sort of example, like the Galactus in this case was the herald of things to come, which is this deck succeeding was indicative of the sort of directional correctness of its approach, which is to say, be bigger than these guys. Don't let them interact with you. Remember that Marvel Snap is a game you win when you have more points than your opponent. Shou-Lao presents a challenge, but it's hardly a challenge that our combo decks are not up for. And I think that is the biggest thing. The combo decks in Marvel Snap are absolutely up to this challenge, in my humble opinion. Shou-Lao is a very powerful card, and I think arguably a nerfable card for what it has done to the mid-range section of this tier list. But this is sort of combo in bloom here because it is a powerful card that is fundamentally linear. The most you're ever doing with a Shou-Lao is getting a bunch of numbers and making those numbers go ×2. These combo decks get a bunch of numbers and make those numbers go way more than ×2. Alternatively, they just blow up your entire board. That works too. I want to take a minute to talk about the tier 2-ish mid-range decks that I mentioned. I think V-Hand is sort of the poster girl for this stuff, where she's just a little bit weaker than the stuff other people are doing. But I do think that the combination of Super Adaptoid and Shadow King kind of gives you a lot of outs in the Shou-Lao matchup, as long as they're focused on, I mean, frankly, really whatever they're focused on. I know the Shou-Lao decks have been like trimming on the Spider Maverick stuff. I find it hard to believe that's correct, but as long as they're doing it, Super Adaptoid might not be that great. But Shadow King and Super Adaptoid put those decks in a pretty reasonable pin, where it's like, oh, okay, if I do have priority, Shadow King is going to be really big. If I don't have priority, well, the Super Adaptoid is going to take away my Scarlet Spider activation. That kind of stuff is pretty interesting to me. Like, there's some real power in that. And I think that largely the only problem V-Hand has is that it is almost in the destroy role here, where Shou-Lao has so much time to do what they want to do. Shou-Lao's combo, in effect, is something they can do on the final turn of the game. They don't have to draw Shou-Lao very early. They just have to get one of the activators out by turn 5 and then Shou-Lao on 6, right? This deck actually has a little more of its power locked behind how good your early draw is, because if you are not copying V-Hand, you are not hitting Shou-Lao levels of power. And so largely that dynamic is something that I have applied into analyzing Destroy. Part of why Destroy started to fall off big time and was like constantly on the back of these tier lists, like kind of a gag, is because Destroy doesn't access all of its power consistently. It has very high rolls, but it requires good opening hands in order to even get to the point where it is outputting on the same level as other decks in the same space as it. And I think that sort of applies to V-Hand here, where if you are not really doing the cool stuff, the metagame is such right now, after the nerfs that applied to this deck, that you can really get got by just not having enough power. Because if you get rid of one of those cards, Shadow King and Super Adaptoid aren't going to win you the matchup on their own. Shou-Lao himself is still a 5/8 that gives a bunch of stuff power, right? That's still good enough to beat you some of the time if you're not also doing your thing. I think ongoing, I say this pretty much every tier list, this is just like the world's most underrated deck. Nobody respects this deck the way they're supposed to respect this deck. It is almost never actually a bad choice. It can be like fairly medium, but I would be absolutely unsurprised to see a high-level player playing this deck at a high level at any given time. Frankly, I would argue this is probably the most consistent deck in Marvel Snap. Some version of this in whatever form has basically been around the entire time. I've been trying out Iron Lad in it. I think it's good. I think if you don't want to play Iron Lad, maybe a Stardust to keep your opponent's output on Scarlet Spider a little bit lower might be good. Stardust also covers a bunch of just random stuff and is an ongoing, but Iron Lad has a bunch of really good hits here, and I think you are kind of interested in really good hits. You could also go back to the Juggernaut Cosmo version of ongoing, but I have found that that is less valuable to me right now, because there are just so many less people who are actually meaningfully interacting with you, and part of the value of that stuff is to prevent that from happening. I would rather like just not have Juggernaut in here right now and just be about my power output, because Shou-Lao is so uniquely good against Juggernaut in ways that are very notable. So I think that that is the biggest thing for me about this list, where it's just like, I just want to focus on my output and play this as close to a combo deck as I can get in the Shou-Lao matchup and dare them to do something about it, basically. In the spirit of decks that have really high point ceilings and don't die to Cosmo and Deafening Chord, I think that this is a list that could be plausible. It has a couple of Deafening Chord weaknesses, but we'll see. This is, of course, a Living Tribunal list where, again, the premise here is just, look, your Shou-Lao is very cute. My numbers are much larger. That's the entire idea here. The Shou-Lao decks are focusing on tech for mirrors and things of that nature. And frankly, decks like this are part of why I like the first Shou-Lao list as much as I do, because just having a deck that's like Cable, Copycat, Spider-Ham against a combo deck gives you a lot more equity in that matchup than would otherwise exist. And I think that that kind of stuff is part of why I like that list, is because I see the metagame in this way. I look at the metagame and I'm like, okay, well, one, this stuff is pretty good against other Shou-Lao lists. Two, this stuff is pretty reasonable against all the combo decks that are going to beat the crap out of me for being a Shou-Lao list. So, like, if I'm playing against Zombie Galacti, and my Copycat shows this on the bottom of the deck, I'm feeling pretty good, right? Like, that kind of equity is just not stuff you get anywhere else. And it does mean that the deck itself is a little bit thin, but having these reasonable matchups into this kind of stuff, I think is probably worth it. I could be off base, but that is where my head is at. This is, of course, Living Tribunal combined with just basic Onslaught Prodigy combo. You can do whichever fully dumb combo you feel like doing. Putting 100 points in the side lanes will beat a Shou-Lao. It just will. If you are doing something like getting an Onslaught on a Mr. Fantastic lane, and then you go Mystique Prodigy on that lane, they lose. It's really just Deafening Chord or bust. And if they don't hit that or they don't have it, the game is over. Another example of a deck that's just trying to do something as dumb as possible and ignore all of the noise about Shou-Lao is various forms of Galactus, Infusion, Fastball Special, Man Spider. This whole archetype is not particularly well flushed out. I know that sounds weird, but I actually think there's room to grow in this archetype in ways that are probably a little bit surprising, but I do think that there is room for this archetype to meaningfully improve. And that's not really what I expected to be saying about this deck, but it is the kind of thing where it's like, no, this deck is making a legitimate point. Like, you guys are doing all this on board, ooh, I've got a Scarlet Spider that I'm gonna make. Like, what if you just didn't have lanes? What if your lanes didn't exist, bro? What if instead of having a lane to put a Scarlet Spider in, you didn't? What if that didn't exist? And I think that's just like a very reasonable question to ask. I don't like that Galactus has sort of slid into a role as like an anti-onboard combo tech piece, but I do think it's fair to describe him as that. That's what this deck is. This deck is a deck that is packing a bunch of things that are like, oh, nice Jocasta combo, idiot. I do not care. And that's the premise of it. A couple extra show lists on the back end. This is Sizer's list. I remain like, I don't know. I'm not saying you need to be an all-in show deck, but I am saying I would really like to figure out a way to have Maverick in these decks that don't. And I understand what this deck is doing. I like that it is like, you know, okay, we got this, like, we're using, Shadow King is normally terrible in show mirrors, but if we have a Stardust, it's actually like a much more reasonable card in the matchup. I think all that stuff kind of makes sense. I like that Stardust can turn off the downside of our Void if we need that to happen. Like, there are cool things happening here. There's nothing wrong with any of this. But it does sort of strike me as like maybe bringing a knife to a gunfight and then being like, well, I will simply just outskill them with the knife. And the fact that there are people in the world who can do that, it's true, doesn't mean that it's a good idea to do, right? Like, that's sort of the place I'm at with this list. I feel like there's gotta be something we can do to soup this deck up and at least make it a crossbow instead of a knife that we're bringing to the gunfight. I'm not gonna lie to you, I think this deck is like one bug fix away from being actually busted, and that bug fix is Penny Parker Spider and Multiple Man. The way it should work is that a copy of Multiple Man that has the spider attached to it, i.e. if your turn 4 is Iron Fist, play the spider on a Multiple Man lane, what that should do is make 2 Multiple Men that move. It doesn't. Only the original Multiple Man can move. That is actually a bug, as far as I am aware. This is the kind of deck, though, where it's like, this is really close to being actually good. But I also think it represents something about Shou-Lao that people have been averse to noticing, which is, secretly, Shou-Lao is mostly a combo deck. It's got, sometimes there's a Cosmo in it, sometimes there's a Deafening Chord in it, sometimes there's a Stardust in it, but it doesn't have the density of spaces that something like Invisible Woman First Steps did, where that deck was able to run like Mercury, Mobius, and Stardust, all of them with more power than they have now, or being cheaper, and sort of be a combo deck that also had all this powerful onboard interaction that won it a bunch of games as well. So that made it impossible for like decks to really go over the top of it in meaningful ways, because we just didn't have tools that would deal with what it was able to do at the time. Because like if you were trying to play a Tribunal deck, you would lose to the Mobius. If you were trying to play a Hela deck, you would lose to the Stardust. If you were trying to play a move combo deck, you would of course lose to the Mercury. The things to go that were able to go over the top of it were able to be stopped by the tech it could actually play. With Shou-Lao, that's just not true. Like Shou-Lao doesn't have the room in its deck list to stop all this stuff from happening. It just doesn't exist, right? So that's actually the big secret of this metagame, is if you zoom out, Shou-Lao's a combo deck and the bigger combo decks beat it. That's it. That's what's going on here. If Shou-Lao reminds me of anything, I've thought about this for a really long time. In 2023, when Hitmonkey cost 2 energy and Bounce was good, and Bounce was just better than every mid-range deck, but nobody realized that dynamic was so stark. They just like didn't process it in the right way. And it was like, okay, Bounce is better than every mid-range deck, but like, let's just keep playing mid-range decks. You can't do that, right? Like that's the thing. That's what Shou-Lao is doing right now. It's better than every mid-range deck by virtue of being mostly a combo deck. There are interactive pieces in it, but it is mostly a combo deck. It is more a combo deck than Invisible Woman First Steps was, for example. It plays less interaction. That's the dynamic that I think is particularly interesting here, because it's a fairly small combo deck as combo decks go, but it's big enough to beat all the mid-range decks that don't really have meaningful tools to interact with it. It's like Bounce. It's like Hela almost. Like that's kind of the vibe here. That's what I think Shou-Lao is most like. And I think that people reacting to that by just being like, all right, nice 40 points, here's 95. That's a reasonable way to approach this matchup. And that's kind of the big thing here. Because when you look at this deck, this is the most combo-y version of Shou-Lao you'll ever see, right? This is Phoenix Force. This is just like, it's Phoenix Force. You're making Phoenix Force. That's what's happening here. That's what's going on. And it's like, oh, okay, that's what this is. You're just doing Phoenix Force stuff. You're doing Nimrod stuff. That's what this deck is. It's just a combo deck. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful evening. And I kind of ran out of things to say.